there is a family you have never heard of that made the Sacklers look like amateurs. Not because they sold a dangerous drug, not because they profited from addiction, but because they industrialized dependency on a scale the modern world had never witnessed. Before Purdue, Pharma, before OxyContin, before the opioid crisis became a national tragedy, there was a dynasty that addicted an empire twice the territory, 10 times the population, and consequences that still shape geopolitics today. The Sacklers destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives and walked away with roughly $20 billion before accountability caught up. But a century earlier, another family did the same thing, only bigger. They addicted millions, destabilized Asia, bankrupted China, and then walked away with British knighthoods and their names carved into hospitals, libraries, and schools. This is the story of the Sassoon family, the opium merchants who built modern Mumbai, bankrupted Qing China, and were rewarded as heroes. And if you think this is ancient history, if you think humanity learned its lesson, go look inside your medicine cabinet. Because the playbook has not changed. The drug changed. The faces changed. The con remained identical. Our story begins in 1832. A Jewish merchant family flees Baghdad under the rule of Dawood Pasha, a governor known for extortion, brutality, and a paranoia that turned Baghdad's merchant class into targets. David Sassoon, the family patriarch, escapes with little more than connections, knowledge, and instinct. First Iran. Then, studying the global map, like a general assessing a battlefield, he sees an opportunity unlike any other. British-controlled India. Specifically, Bombay, an exploding colonial port city, where cotton, silver, textiles, and human ambition collided under the supervision of the British East India Company. But this was not a company. It was a corporate empire with its own army, currency, courts, and laws. At its height, the East India Company's private military surpassed the size of most European armies. It taxed millions, conquered kingdoms, and bent entire societies to the economic needs of London shareholders who never set foot in Asia. By the 1830s, the company had turned the Indian subcontinent into an extraction machine, and its most profitable export was not spices or cotton. It was opium. David Sassoon arrived in Bombay with near zero capital, but carried 3 assets more valuable than gold. First, connections. A deep merchant network stretching across the Middle East, built by his father, the chief treasurer of Baghdad. These were not mere acquaintances, but tribal, religious, and familial alliances. Trust-based links, functioning like an early version of a multinational logistics network. Second, political literacy. Growing up around Baghdad's inner financial circles, David understood how to navigate power structures, how to position himself as indispensable, and how to exploit the blind spots of bureaucratic empires. Third, timing. Britain was facing an existential economic crisis, and the solution it had chosen was one of history's darkest economic strategies: addict an entire nation to narcotics. Tea, silk, and porcelain were the lifeblood of British high society. Tea drinking had gone from a luxury to a national dependency. But China did not want anything Britain produced, so the Qing dynasty demanded payment, silver only. The result was catastrophic for Britain. Millions of pounds of silver leaked out of its economy yearly. Imagine a modern economic superpower hemorrhaging foreign reserves to a rival nation, unable to sell domestic products, losing monetary stability month after month. London felt the panic. Silver shortages threatened financial collapse. And when economic desperation mixes with imperial ambition, morality disappears. Britain's solution was simple and monstrous. Grow opium in India. Destroy China with it. Massive poppy plantations spread across Bengal. Under East India Company supervision, farmers were forced through debt, coercion, or starvation to abandon food crops for opium. The company bought the raw sap, refined it into powerful narcotics, packed it into standardized chests, and auctioned it to merchants. Almost all of it funneled into China, where addiction exploded. By 1830, British India produced over 1,500 tons of opium per year, 14% of colonial government revenue. 1 in every 7 rupees came from drugs. Roads, ports, police salaries, military campaigns, and bureaucratic edifices were built on narcotics money. This was the world David Sassoon walked into, and he saw it with crystal clarity. This was not just a trade. This was a state-protected criminal enterprise disguised as governance. Most merchants bought opium at auction and shipped it. Sassoon understood the deeper mechanic. True wealth comes not from participating in the system, but from controlling it. So he built a vertically integrated empire, financing cultivation in India, warehousing the opium near ports, operating his own global fleet of ships, building an insurance company to cover those shipments, deploying multilingual agents across every major port from Kolkata to Canton, and aligning himself tightly with British officials so that every expansion of his business looked like an expansion of British interests. The British welcomed him. The empire needed merchants who could carry out its dirtiest work while maintaining plausible deniability. Sassoon became the perfect partner, loyal, efficient, and discreet. By 1836, the Sassoon family was shipping 30,000 chests of opium a year, 3.6 million pounds of narcotics flooding into China annually. By 1850, 50,000 chests. By the 1860s, nearly 60,000. More than 7 million pounds of opium per year. Addiction crippled coastal China. Entire cities hollowed out. Silver that once flowed into China now bled outward into British and Sassoon hands. And the Chinese state, watching its population and economy disintegrate, finally tried to stop it. In 1839, the emperor dispatched Lin Zexu, one of the most principled officials in Chinese history, to end the trade. Lin confiscated 1,400 tons of opium from foreign merchants and destroyed it. Then he wrote a powerful letter to Queen Victoria, questioning Britain's moral right to poison a nation with a drug it restricted at home. Britain responded not with ethics, but artillery. 16 British warships launched what became known as the First Opium War. China, lacking modern naval capabilities, was crushed. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to pay compensation, open ports, cede Hong Kong, and grant legal privileges to British merchants. Not a word legalizing opium was necessary. The new terms made enforcement impossible. The Sassoons, who had backed Britain throughout the war, were rewarded with first access to the newly opened ports. Their empire surged. When China tried again to enforce its laws in the 1850s, Britain and France waged the Second Opium War, culminating in the destruction of Beijing's old summer palace, an act of cultural violence whose scars remain politically relevant today. With the Treaty of Tientsin, opium became fully legal. The Sassoon Empire entered its golden age. By the 1860s, the Sassoon Empire had become something the world had never seen before. A private narcotics corporation operating on a global scale with diplomatic protection from the world's most powerful empire. While Britain claimed China was backward, corrupt, and resistant to free trade, the reality was simpler and darker. A single commodity now underpinned two imperial economies, British India and the Sassoon Syndicate, and both would collapse without it. Opium revenue funded colonial governance, British naval operations, and the expansion of Bombay as a regional capital. And it funded something else: the transformation of the Sassoon family from refugees into aristocrats. David Sassoon's sons Abdallah, who renamed himself Albert, Elias, Sassoon David, and others were educated in British schools, dressed in English fashions, and spoke in the polished accents of the Victorian upper class. They were no longer merchants. They became industrialists, bankers, philanthropists, and political influencers. And like every powerful family, they diversified. Textile mills in Bombay, cotton exports to Manchester, real estate, shipping lines, banks. But opium remained the beating heart of their wealth. They did not just trade it, they engineered logistics around it. They built fortified warehouses in Hong Kong and Canton. They operated fleets of clippers, optimized for speed to outrun Chinese patrols during the early restrictive years. They constructed customs like systems to verify purity. They even implemented accounting practices that modern economists consider decades ahead of their time. By the late 19th century, Sassoon meant something specific in Asia, a shadow empire that could move goods faster, safer, and more reliably than most governments. The British called them the Rothschilds of the East. But in private correspondence, colonial officials were even more blunt. The Sassoons were essential. That word appears repeatedly in archived letters, essential to commerce, essential to revenue, essential to imperial strategy. Essential because removing them would collapse a trade. Britain publicly condemned, yet privately relied upon. And yet the family never carried the stigma that drug barons carry today. On the contrary, British elites embraced them. Albert Sassoon was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1872. Universities accepted their donations. Hospitals bore their names. Their philanthropy in Bombay schools, libraries, synagogues, public works cemented them as civic heroes. This duality became the core of their identity. Saints at home, traffickers abroad. The Sacklers would perfect the same formula a century later. But beneath the prosperity, cracks were forming. China was changing. The Qing dynasty's legitimacy decayed under internal rebellion, foreign invasion, and economic collapse, all fueled by addiction. By the 1890s, millions were dependent on opium. Productivity plummeted. Military readiness collapsed. Corruption skyrocketed. And across the coasts, a quiet rage toward foreign powers brewed. The opium trade did not merely weaken China, it rewired its national memory. Modern Chinese nationalism, the belief that foreign powers humiliated and exploited China, was born from this era. In every Chinese textbook today, the Opium Wars are the first chapter of the century of humiliation, and the Sassoons played a central role, though their name is rarely mentioned. Then, in 1906, something extraordinary happened. Britain, the very empire that had forced opium onto China at gunpoint, announced it would end the trade. Not because of morality, but because China had begun its own anti-opium movement. Mass eradications, rehabilitation programs, and strict anti-drug laws. And London, under diplomatic pressure and fearing instability, pivoted to ethics after a century of exploitation. For the first time, the Sassoon Empire faced existential threat. The family responded with remarkable agility. They transitioned rapidly from narcotics to legitimate industries, textiles, oil, real estate, shipping, and banking. Elias Sassoon expanded into Shanghai's international settlement, building the Sassoon House, later the iconic Peace Hotel on the Bund. Victor Sassoon, perhaps the most flamboyant of the dynasty, turned Shanghai into his playground during the 1920s and 30s. Art Deco skyscrapers, luxury hotels, international clubs, horse racing tracks. He represented the new face of the family. Glamorous, charismatic, cosmopolitan, a man photographed with movie stars and diplomats, far removed from the opium chests that financed his inheritance. But history has a way of catching up. The Japanese invasion of China in the 1930s shattered the Sassoon world. Shanghai fell. Assets were seized. War ended the family's eastern dominance. After World War II, their fortune fractured across generations, investments, and continents. And as the British Empire declined, so did the structures that had protected them. By the 1960s, the Sassoon Empire had all but dissolved, absorbed into multinational corporations, or lost through mismanagement. Yet the legacy did not vanish. It simply mutated. You can still walk through Mumbai and see their fingerprints. Sassoon docks, built for the fishing industry. The David Sassoon Library. Synagogues they funded. The Sassoon Hospital in Pune. In Shanghai, tourists still flock to the Peace Hotel, unaware that its marble floors, chandeliers, and lavish ballrooms were financed by the profits of narcotics that destabilized a civilization. Even the modern pharmaceutical industry, through corporate structures and distribution networks, echoes the Sassoon blueprint. Control production, control logistics, control regulation, and position yourself as a benefactor of public welfare. And then, in the 1990s, the playbook resurfaced in America almost identically. A new dynasty used medical authority instead of colonial authority, prescription pads instead of gunboats, and marketing instead of missionaries. The Sacklers followed the same formula. Create dependency, normalize it through institutions, expand until regulation fails, then blame the victims. The difference is scale. The Sassoons operated in a world without global media, human rights conventions, or international courts. Their actions shaped geopolitics, but escaped moral scrutiny for a century. The Sacklers faced lawsuits, documentaries, and public outrage because the modern world could see the devastation in real time. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Governments enabled both. Britain built its empire on opium revenue. American regulators allowed opioid marketing to spiral unchecked. When a state benefits from a drug economy, accountability dissolves. That is why the Sassoons were knighted, not prosecuted. Why the Sacklers kept billions even after settlements. Why addiction epidemics, whether in 19th century China or 21st century America, are not accidents. They are policy failures, and the consequences reverberate. China's modern stance on national sovereignty, foreign interference, and moral suspicion toward the West is inseparable from the opium century. India's economic transformation under colonial rule was shaped by forced poppy cultivation. Global drug policies, today harsh, reactionary, often ineffective, are rooted in the trauma of societies exploited through addiction. When you trace the threads backward, they all lead to the same place: a partnership between empire and private capital, using chemicals to reshape nations. History rarely repeats verbatim, but it rhymes with unsettling precision. And the rhyme began with a family fleeing persecution, rebuilding their lives, and discovering that the fastest way to wealth was to sell the world a sickness it could not resist. The Sassoons mastered it first. The Sacklers perfected it later. And unless governments learn from both, another empire, another dynasty will rise to do it again. To understand how deeply the Sassoon Empire reshaped the modern world, you have to follow the money after the fall, because the end of their narcotics business did not end the systems they built. It simply released those systems into the bloodstream of global capitalism. Logistics chains they pioneered became templates for multinational corporations. Banking structures they developed in Bombay influenced colonial finance for decades. Their strategic alignment with imperial power became a model for how private companies could merge with state objectives to create uncontested dominance. And the vacuum they left behind did not disappear. It was filled by new players, new substances, and new geopolitical ambitions. When the opium economy collapsed in the early 20th century, an economic shock rippled across Asia. China had spent decades fighting addiction and rebuilding national institutions. Indian farmers had to transition away from poppy cultivation after generations of dependency on the colonial crop. British administrators scrambled to replace a revenue source that had financed infrastructure, bureaucracy, and military presence. And the Sassoon family, long shielded by empire, faced a world where colonial authority was weakening and their privileges no longer guaranteed. Their withdrawal created something rare in global history: a massive commercial vacuum in a sector too profitable to stay empty. The first entities to move into this void were not families, but states. Japan, seeking industrial ascendancy and imperial expansion, aggressively pursued control of opiate production in Manchuria. The Kuomintang government in China, desperate for revenue during the warlord era, entered the narcotics business itself. Even Western pharmaceutical companies, under the guise of medical research, began synthesizing new opioid derivatives. What had been a private empire in the 19th century became a geopolitical industry in the 20th century. The Sassoons were gone, but the infrastructure they built, the ports, the courier networks, the warehousing methods, and even the corruptible officials remained in place like an empty skeleton, waiting for new flesh. Meanwhile, the family retreated into the world of finance. Victor Sassoon relocated to the Bahamas and later London, shifting from real estate to banking. Others invested in mining, insurance, and manufacturing. Yet even as their portfolio diversified, the shadow of their original fortune lingered. Philanthropic efforts made their name appear in museums, hospitals, and cultural institutions, particularly in Britain and India. And here lies the uncomfortable symmetry, the same pattern repeated by the Sacklers a century later. When wealth comes from a product that destroys lives, public philanthropy becomes a shield, a strategy to rewrite legacy through architecture, art, and prestige. The Sassoons did it first, quietly and successfully. The Sacklers attempted it in a world with cameras. But history was not done with the Sassoon legacy. The geopolitical scars of the opium era influenced the formation of modern China more than any other single event. When the Communist Party came to power in 1949, eradicating opium became one of its first and proudest achievements. Mao's government executed dealers, destroyed crops, shut down dens, and implemented social rehabilitation programs on a massive scale. In less than a decade, a nation once called the sick man of Asia defeated the addiction epidemic that had haunted it for a century. And the memory of how that epidemic began shaped Chinese foreign policy permanently. Any modern observer who wonders why China reacts fiercely to foreign interference, why it demands control over economic dependencies, or why it views Western powers with skepticism, only needs to revisit the Sassoon era. Opium was not just a drug. It was a weapon, a chemical invasion, a lesson written into collective memory. Foreign powers will exploit any weakness for profit. This belief is not paranoia. It is historical experience, and it explains why, in the 21st century, China invests aggressively in self-sufficiency, infrastructure, and state control over critical industries. The century of humiliation taught Beijing that dependency is vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to domination. As China rebuilt, India followed a different trajectory. Independence, in 1947, ended colonial forced cultivation of poppies, but it left behind an economy structured around extraction. Many of the mills, trading houses, and administrative buildings the Sassoons constructed became part of India's industrial base. Their architectural legacy in Mumbai libraries, docks, hospitals, synagogues remained woven into the urban fabric. But the deeper legacy was institutional, the use of financial leverage, logistics dominance, and political patronage to build private empires. These methods reappeared in India's own corporate dynasties of the late 20th century, from textiles to telecom. A different context, a different product, but the same skeleton. Meanwhile, the global narcotics economy evolved again. Synthetic opioids, far stronger than anything the Sassoons ever shipped, entered the world stage. Morphine, heroin, later oxycodone, fentanyl, and analogs exponentially more potent. The dream of every empire, from Victorian Britain to modern corporations, remained the same. A product that generates dependency, guarantees repeat consumption, and can be distributed at scale. The Sassoons controlled an agricultural-based drug economy. The Sacklers controlled a pharmaceutical-based one. Today's cartels control a synthetic one. The line between them is not moral, it is technological. This is why the Sassoon story matters. It reveals a recurring pattern in global capitalism. When extraordinary profit exists, morality becomes optional, and the most dangerous industries often gain state protection. Not because governments approve of them, but because governments benefit from them. Britain used opium to reverse a silver deficit. The U.S. pharmaceutical system used opioids to fuel a multi-billion-dollar healthcare economy. Modern governments, even when aware of the dangers, move slowly because economic incentives outweigh ethical urgency. In each case, the public suffers, the powerful profit, and history repeats with different packaging. But there is an even more unsettling connection that few acknowledge. The geopolitical conflicts of the 21st century trade wars, sanctions, supply chain battles reflect historical anxieties rooted in the opium era. China's insistence on controlling technology flows, scarce minerals, semiconductors, and data is not simply strategic ambition. It is a response to a historical trauma, where lack of control allowed foreign powers to dictate national fate. Western governments, meanwhile, criticize this caution, without acknowledging the irony. It was Western intervention that created the caution in the first place. This is the long shadow of the Sassoons. By the end of the 20th century, the family name carried little public controversy. Their descendants live quietly across the U.S., Europe, and Israel. Their philanthropy is still celebrated. Their role in narcotics history rarely appears in textbooks. Yet their impact reverberates in every conversation about global trade, sovereignty, addiction, and the relationship between corporations and states. They pioneered a model of global influence where business and empire blend seamlessly, where profit dictates policy, and where the consequences are paid not by the powerful, but by the powerless. And while the Sassoon Empire dissolved, the world they shaped did not. If anything, it became more sophisticated, more discreet, more institutional, because the greatest lesson they taught the world was not how to traffic opium. It was how to traffic influence, how to shape nations without ruling them, how to profit without accountability, how to hide a dark origin beneath charitable light. The Sacklers inherited that lesson. Modern corporations use it. Governments tolerate it. And unless history is confronted honestly, the cycle will repeat. Not with opium in wooden chests, but with new products, new technologies, and new forms of dependency engineered by those who understand exactly what the Sassoons discovered nearly 2 centuries ago. The most profitable business in the world is the one people cannot stop consuming. If the story ended with the fall of the Sassoons, history would be cleaner, tragic, but contained. But empires built on addiction never die neatly. Their logic, their incentives, their architecture leak into the future. They mutate. They evolve. They migrate from ports to boardrooms, from colonial ships to pharmaceutical supply chains, from imperial decrees to corporate lobbying. And that is why the true final chapter of the Sassoon story is not about the family at all. It is about the global system they helped engineer, one that still determines who profits, who suffers, and who gets to write the definition of crime. After World War II, as the Sassoon Empire dissolved, the world entered a new age of regulation. International drug control treaties, moral campaigns, scientific oversight on paper. Humanity had learned its lesson. But these frameworks were built on a selective memory. Western nations condemned opium, yet avoided confronting their own role in creating the crisis. China eradicated addiction, but its trauma hardened into geopolitical distrust. The United States led global anti-narcotics policy, while its own pharmaceutical companies quietly prepared a new wave of dependence. The world outlawed the drug, but kept the economic logic, and the vacuum left by the Sassoons did not stay empty for long. The Cold War transformed narcotics into a geopolitical weapon. Intelligence agencies used heroin networks in Southeast Asia to fund anti-communist militias. Superpowers turned a blind eye to trafficking, if the traffickers served the right side. The Golden Triangle became the new Canton, a remote yet strategically vital region where warlords, insurgents, and governments profited from the same chemical leverage that once enriched Bombay elites. The Sassoon playbook reappeared in miniature: align with power, exploit chaos, dominate logistics, and hide criminality behind political necessity. The faces changed. The incentives did not. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical revolution accelerated. Synthetic chemistry unlocked new opioids, cleaner, stronger, more medical. The corporate world learned something the Sassoons instinctively understood. If you attach a moral narrative to a harmful product, you can neutralize public resistance. The Sacklers studied this better than anyone. They wrapped addiction in scientific language, in white coats and clinical brochures. They transformed a narcotic into a prescription. They marketed a drug as a right, a treatment, a necessity. And once that narrative took hold, the revenue stream became unstoppable. It was the same formula the Sassoons executed: build trust, disguise harm, scale dependency, and let institutions do the defending. Yet while the West faced its prescription crisis, another transformation was happening on the other side of the world. China, once crippled by opium, became the manufacturing spine of the global economy. It built ports, factories, pharmaceutical plants, chemical labs, and logistical infrastructures with an intensity unmatched in history. Ironically, the nation once destroyed by narcotics became the primary producer of precursor chemicals used to synthesize them, not because China sought to repeat the Sassoon model, but because global capitalism had become too interconnected and too blind to prevent it. Western demand met Chinese supply in a convergence no one anticipated. Fentanyl, a compound far deadlier than opium, began flowing into North America in quantities small enough to evade detection, but powerful enough to reshape mortality statistics. Cartels harnessed the new chemistry. Online sellers bypassed borders. Postal routes became the new opium clippers. And suddenly, the United States found itself facing a crisis eerily similar to China's century earlier. A population dependent on a substance too profitable for any single actor to stop. The symmetry is striking. China once begged Britain to stop the flow. Today, America demands China regulate precursor chemicals. China once accused the West of weaponizing narcotics. Now, some politicians claim Beijing is allowing fentanyl materials to escape its borders. Neither situation is identical, but the psychological echoes are impossible to ignore. The Sassoon story did not just shape the past, it created the template for modern accusations, modern diplomacy, and modern mistrust. When nations remember themselves as victims of chemical invasion, every new crisis becomes personal. Yet focusing on state rivalry misses the deeper truth. The real enemy is the economic system that rewards addiction. The Sassoons thrived because they solved a problem for an empire. The Sacklers thrived because they solved one for a healthcare industry hungry for profit. Cartels thrive because they solve one for consumers living in despair. Fentanyl thrives because it solves one for manufacturers seeking efficiency. Remove the individuals, and the incentives remain intact. That is why the fall of dynasties never stops the cycle. History punishes faces, not forces. It condemns the merchant, not the market. It targets the trafficker, not the underlying machinery that makes trafficking inevitable. And the machinery has only grown stronger since the 19th century. The global supply chain is faster. The chemical industry is more advanced. Debt, despair, inequality, and instability, fertile soil for dependency, have all deepened. The Sassoons built the prototype. The modern world scaled it. And yet, there is an irony that history rarely acknowledges. Despite the devastation unleashed by the opium trade, the Sassoon family believed with genuine conviction that they were builders, not destroyers. They constructed libraries, hospitals, docks, schools, synagogues. They saw themselves as benefactors, innovators, and visionaries. In their minds, philanthropy redeemed profit. Civilization justified cost. The same rationalization would echo from Purdue pharma executives defending OxyContin as a medical breakthrough. The same logic appears in corporate ESG reports today. If you build something visible, society forgives the invisible. But the world is changing. The digital age has made invisible harm visible. Documents leak. Data spreads. Histories once buried in archives resurface online. Narratives, protected for a century, unravel in days. And for the first time, both ordinary people and governments are revisiting the legacy of addiction-driven economies with clarity rather than myth. China now teaches the opium wars as a foundational national trauma. The United States, after denying its opioid crisis for years, now acknowledges it as one of the greatest failures in modern healthcare. India revisits its colonial agricultural policies and the economic distortions they created. The world is waking up to patterns that once remained hidden under philanthropy and imperial rhetoric. And this leads us to the final, uncomfortable revelation. The opium economy never really ended. It simply shifted form. Today's equivalent is not a drug, but a dependency. Digital, chemical, financial, psychological, social media engineered for compulsion, fast fashion engineered for waste, financial systems engineered for debt, pharmaceuticals engineered for lifetime consumption. These dependencies generate profit streams as predictable as opium once did, streams that governments rely on, corporations defend, and consumers cannot easily escape. That is the true legacy of the Sassoons, not the opium itself, but the discovery that addiction of any kind is the perfect business model, a model scalable across continents, eras, technologies, and industries, a model adopted by empires, corporations, and states alike, a model so deeply woven into the global economy that moral outrage arrives only when the consequences become impossible to hide. The Sassoons were not the first to exploit human vulnerability. They were merely the first to globalize it. And as long as the systems they pioneered remain intact, the world will continue living in the long aftershocks of an empire built on dependency. If the story of the Sassoons teaches us anything, it is that systems born from exploitation do not fade. They embed themselves into institutions, ideologies, and everyday behaviors so deeply that people forget they were engineered at all. The modern world prides itself on progress, on regulation, on ethics committees and international frameworks. Yet it remains governed by the same fundamental engine, profit from dependence. By the late 20th century, global capitalism had matured into something far more sophisticated than the trade empires of the 1800s. Technology accelerated markets, deregulation, atomized accountability, supply chains stretched across oceans. And in this new terrain, addiction did not need a drug. It only needed a habit. The logic that once fueled opium now powered entire industries, and infinite scrolling as the new pipe, and algorithmic dopamine as the new narcotic, as consumer debt as the new dependency cycle, and pharmaceuticals for every discomfort, and commodities priced on human weakness rather than human need. This was not a conspiracy. It was an evolution. Systems do not seek morality. They seek efficiency. And dependency, chemical or digital, emotional or financial, is the most efficient revenue model ever invented. In this landscape, the Sassoons' legacy becomes less a historical footnote and more a blueprint. They proved that controlling a substance is less important than controlling the behavior around it. And that insight reshaped the 21st century more profoundly than any dynasty, any war, or any policy. Governments now face a challenge greater than narcotics, the challenge of compulsion itself. How do you regulate attention when attention is currency? How do you police financial addiction when entire economies rely on credit? How do you counter chemical dependency when healthcare profits from lifelong prescriptions? The struggle has shifted from fighting substances to fighting architectures. And yet, for the first time in 2 centuries, the world is becoming aware of these architectures, not because institutions revealed them, but because individuals learned how to see through them. The same digital networks that addict also expose. The same global markets that exploit also illuminate. The same technologies that manipulate also archive. History, once filtered through empires, can now be read by anyone with a connection. And with that clarity comes a reckoning. Governments re-examine their complicity. Citizens question narratives they once accepted. Corporations realize that invisibility, their greatest shield, is disappearing. Multinational supply chains face scrutiny. Philanthropic facades face skepticism. Addiction of any kind faces understanding, rather than stigma. This shift is slow, uneven, imperfect, but it is real, and it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Sassoon story. Addiction, economies thrive not because villains create them, but because societies enable them. The empire the Sassoons built no longer exists. The ports are gone. The warehouses are museums. The family is dispersed. But the system they helped shape remains the system that rewards dependence, disguises harm, institutionalizes denial, and converts human vulnerability into the world's most resilient currency. The true empire was never the Sassoons. It was never the Sacklers. It was never any cartel, corporation, or dynasty. The real empire is the machinery of addiction itself. An empire without borders, without rulers, without a single face to blame. And unlike the Sassoons, this empire did not fall. It globalized. It digitized. It normalized. We are not living in the aftermath of the opium age. We are living inside its evolution. The story does not end with the collapse of a family business in Bombay. It ends here, in a world still structured by dependency, still shaped by incentives born 2 centuries ago, still struggling to understand how a drug trade became a template for modern life. And until humanity confronts not the traffickers, but the systems that make trafficking inevitable, the Sassoon story will never truly be history. It will remain prophecy,